A story of hidden service. He stood by the entrance every day, checking receipts with the same quiet precision. Most customers barely noticed him, just another security guard in a blue vest. But when the armed robbery started, his movements weren't those of a retail worker. They were something else entirely. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of hidden identity and unexpected heroism, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The Walmart on Highway 92 never closed. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sliding doors welcomed everyone, from night shift workers buying coffee to families doing weekend shopping. And for the past 3 years, Frank had been there to greet them all. He arrived every morning at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his shift, not because he had to, but because habits formed over decades don't break easily. He'd park his 2018 Honda Accord in the same spot, employees section, third row back. Nothing flashy, nothing that drew attention. The blue vest with security printed across the back hung loose on his shoulders. At 62, Frank wasn't the imposing figure he'd once been, but there was something in his posture that spoke of years spent standing watch. His hair had gone gray, his face showed lines, earned through sleepless nights and difficult decisions, but his eyes never stopped moving. Most customers saw what they expected to see: a friendly older man checking receipts, helping locate missing items, occasionally dealing with shoplifters who thought stealing from a big chain store was a victimless crime. They saw Frank smile when children waved at him, nod politely when regulars said good morning, and blend seamlessly into the background of their busy lives. What they didn't see was the way he cataloged every face that walked through those doors, the way his gaze lingered just a fraction longer on anyone wearing oversized clothing in summer, or how he positioned himself to maintain clear sightlines to the pharmacy and electronics sections. They didn't notice that he knew every exit, every camera angle, every blind spot in the building. The younger employees called him Mr. Frank. The older ones just nodded when they passed. His supervisor, Maria, appreciated that he never called in sick, never complained about overtime, and had a strange talent for spotting trouble before it started. In 3 years, they'd had fewer theft incidents during his shifts than any other security guard in the store's history. It's like he can smell trouble coming, Maria had told the district manager during Frank's last review. She was right, but not for the reasons she thought. Frank had been smelling trouble for over 20 years, but not at Walmart. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that felt ordinary in every way. The early shift was settling in. The overnight stockers were finishing up, and the first wave of customers was beginning to trickle through the doors. Frank stood at his usual position, just inside the entrance, where you could see the self-checkout area, the customer service desk, and the main aisles. The morning regulars passed by with their routine greetings. Mrs. Chen, with her daily newspaper and coffee purchase. The construction crew, stopping for energy drinks and breakfast sandwiches. The young mother with twins who always bought diapers and formula. Frank's practiced eye swept the store as he checked receipts. A teenager in the electronics section. Normal behavior. Looking at video games. An elderly man comparing prices on blood pressure medication. Routine. A woman in aisle 12 stocking up on cleaning supplies. Nothing unusual. Then he saw him. The man entered through the sliding doors at 8:47 a.m. Frank's internal clock was always precise. Mid-30s, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a dark hoodie despite the October heat. The hood was up, which wasn't uncommon, but something about his movement pattern triggered an alarm in Frank's mind that had been finely tuned over decades. The man's eyes swept the store, but not like a customer looking for something to buy. Frank had seen that scan before. It was tactical, calculating, the way someone maps exits and blind spots and potential complications. Frank maintained his position by the entrance, checking receipts as customers left, but His peripheral vision tracked the hooded figure. The man moved through the store in a pattern that made no sense for shopping. Electronics, pharmacy, then doubling back toward the customer service desk, where the registers held the most cash. At 8:52 a.m., the man approached the customer service counter. There were two employees behind it, Sandra, who'd been working there for 6 years, and Jake, a college kid who'd started last month. Both were focused on their tasks, unaware that their Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Frank stepped away from his position by the entrance. To anyone watching, it looked casual, just a security guard moving to get a better view of the store. But his movement was deliberate, calculated. He positioned himself where he could reach the customer service area in 4 seconds while maintaining a clear line of sight to all exits. The hooded man reached into his pocket. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but for Frank, it unfolded with the clarity that comes from years of high-stakes situations. The man pulled his hand from his pocket, and Frank saw the distinctive outline of a pistol grip. Not brandished yet, but the threat was clear. The man was positioning himself, getting ready to make his demand. Most security guards in this situation would reach for their radio, call for backup, maybe shout a warning. Frank's training went deeper than that. In the span of a heartbeat, Frank's mind processed 17 different variables. The distance to the gunman, 23 feet. The number of civilians in the immediate area, 9. The location of the nearest hardcover, end cap display, 12 feet to his left. The gunman's likely escape route, main entrance, where Frank had been standing. And the response time for local police, 6 to 8 minutes on a good day. Frank moved, but he didn't move like a retail security guard. He moved like someone who'd spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this type of situation. His first step took him behind the greeting card display, breaking the gunman's line of sight while giving Frank concealment. His second step positioned him for an angle of approach that would put civilians behind him rather than in a potential crossfire. His third step began a fluid movement pattern that anyone with tactical training would recognize as a textbook approach to neutralizing an armed threat in a civilian environment. The hooded man finally drew his weapon, pointing it at Sandra behind the customer service counter. "Open the registers," he said, his voice trying to sound calm, but betraying the nervousness of someone who'd never done this before. "All of them, now." Sandra's hands went up instinctively, her face pale with shock. Jake took a step backward, his eyes wide with terror. Neither of them had noticed Frank's movement through the store. "Nobody has to get hurt," the gunman continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Just open the drawers and step back." That's when Frank appeared beside him, not running, not shouting, not making the dramatic gestures that untrained people imagine happen in these situations. Frank simply materialized in the gunman's peripheral vision, with the kind of silent precision that comes from years of practice. "Sir," Frank said, his voice calm and conversational, "I'm going to need you to put that down." The gunman spun toward Frank, weapon swinging in his direction. And that's when 3 years of customers and coworkers got their first glimpse of who Frank really was. Frank's response was instantaneous and perfect. His left hand moved to control the weapon, fingers wrapping around the gunman's wrist with a grip that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. His right hand struck upward, a precise blow to the gunman's elbow that caused his fingers to open involuntarily. The pistol clattered to the floor, but Frank was already moving to his next objective. His right arm wrapped around the gunman's neck in a control hold that applied just enough pressure to limit blood flow without causing permanent damage. The man went limp in approximately 4 seconds. Frank lowered the unconscious gunman to the floor, checked for additional weapons, and secured the pistol before keying his radio. "Code 99, customer service area," he said into his radio, his breathing barely elevated. "One suspect down, weapon secured, request police response." The entire incident, From the moment the gunman drew his weapon to the moment Frank made his radio call had lasted 28 seconds. Sandra and Jake stood frozen behind the counter, staring at Frank with expressions of complete bewilderment. Other customers who had witnessed the event seemed equally stunned. This wasn't the friendly security guard who helped them find the restroom or check their receipts. This was someone else entirely. Frank knelt beside the unconscious gunman, maintaining control of his position while keeping the secured weapon well out of reach. His movements were economical, professional, and utterly calm. "Is everyone okay?" he asked Sandra and Jake, his voice returning to the gentle tone they were accustomed to hearing. Sandra nodded mutely. Jake managed to whisper, what did you... Frank didn't answer. He was listening to his radio as store management and local police coordinated their response. His eyes continued scanning the area, still alert for additional threats, still positioned to respond if the situation escalated. Maria, the shift supervisor, arrived first. She looked at the scene, the unconscious gunman, the secured weapon, Frank's calm control of the situation, and asked the question that was forming in everyone's mind. "Frank, where did you learn to do that?" Frank looked up at her, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained cover slipped. The expression on his face wasn't that of a Walmart security guard. It was the look of someone who'd spent years making split-second decisions in situations where failure meant death. "Long time ago," he said simply. The police arrived 7 minutes later, faster than Frank's estimate, but he'd accounted for variables. Officer Sarah Martinez was the first through the door, weapon drawn, moving with the controlled urgency of someone responding to an armed robbery call. She found Frank still kneeling beside the subdued gunman, the weapon secured and unloaded, the situation completely under control. The unconscious man was beginning to stir, but Frank's positioning ensured he couldn't move without being immediately restrained. "Sir, I need you to step back," Officer Martinez said, following protocol. Frank complied immediately, raising his hands and stepping away from the gunman. But Martinez noticed something in his compliance. It was too smooth, too practiced. This wasn't a civilian awkwardly following police instructions. This was someone who understood exactly how these situations worked. "Are you the security guard who subdued the suspect?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Frank replied. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Frank's account was precise, factual, and delivered with the kind of clarity that Martinez typically only heard from law enforcement professionals. No embellishment, no dramatic details, just a chronological sequence of events with exact times and specific observations. As backup officers arrived and began processing the scene, Martinez found herself studying Frank more carefully. His demeanor, his vocabulary, his positioning, even while being questioned. Everything suggested training that went far beyond basic security work. "Mr. Frank," she said, reading his name tag. "Can I ask about your background? That was some pretty impressive work." Frank's pause was almost imperceptible. "I've had some training," he said. "What kind of training?" Another pause. "Military." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Frank had served in the Marines for 4 years after high school, but that had been 40 years ago, and it wasn't what had prepared him for this morning's events. Detective James Mitchell arrived 20 minutes later. He was a 15-year veteran of the force, and he'd seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't add up. The suspect, now conscious and in custody, had multiple prior arrests for robbery and assault. He wasn't a novice, and he wasn't someone who should have been taken down by a retail security guard without firing a shot or even putting up a fight. Mitchell reviewed the security footage from multiple angles. Frank's response was textbook law enforcement, better than textbook. It was the kind of smooth professional neutralization that suggested years of high-level training and real-world experience. "Mr. Frank," Detective Mitchell said, "I'd like to talk to you privately for a few minutes." Detective James Mitchell arrived 20 minutes later. He was a 15-year veteran of the force, and he'd seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't add up. The suspect, now conscious and in custody, had multiple prior arrests for robbery and assault. He wasn't a novice, and he wasn't someone who should have been taken down by a retail security guard without firing a shot or even putting up a fight. Mitchell reviewed the security footage from multiple angles. Frank's response was textbook law enforcement. Better than textbook. It was the kind of smooth, professional neutralization that suggested years of high-level training and real-world experience. "Mr. Frank," Detective Mitchell said, "I'd like to talk to you privately for a few minutes." They stepped into the store manager's office. Mitchell closed the door and studied Frank's face carefully. "That was some pretty advanced work out there," Mitchell said. "Military training doesn't usually cover armed suspect control in civilian environments." Frank met his gaze steadily. "I've always been good at staying calm under pressure." "Where did you serve?" "Marines. Long time ago." "What did you do after the Marines?" Frank's hesitation was longer this time. "Different things." Mitchell had interviewed enough people to recognize evasion, but he also recognized something else in Frank's demeanor. This wasn't someone hiding criminal activity. This was someone protecting information that he wasn't authorized to share. "Mr. Frank," Mitchell said, quietly, "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've worked with federal agents on joint task forces. I know what that kind of training looks like, and I know where it comes from." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then gave the slightest nod. "Your secret's safe," Mitchell said. "Whatever you did before this, thank you for what you did today."
Murphy's Diner hadn't changed in the 2 years since Frank had last been there. Same red vinyl booths, same coffee that was stronger than it needed to be, same waitress who called everyone hun and meant it. It had been his regular spot during his FBI years, close enough to the field office for quick meals between cases, quiet enough for sensitive conversations. Sarah was already there when he arrived, sitting in their old booth in the back corner. She looked older. The job aged everyone eventually, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the Bureau's most effective administrators. "You're late," she said, as he slid into the seat across from her. "I almost didn't come." "But you did." Frank signaled the waitress for coffee. "What do you want, Sarah?" "To see how you're doing. To make sure you're okay." "I'm fine." "Frank, you took down an armed robber in a Walmart. That's not what fine people do on a Tuesday morning." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "It's not like I went looking for trouble." "No, but trouble found you. And when it did, 20 years of training kicked in. That has to mess with your head." The waitress brought Frank's coffee. He wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth, trying to find words for something he hadn't wanted to think about. "I keep telling myself it was just instinct," he said finally. "Just muscle memory. But that's not true, is it?" "What do you think it was?" "I think part of me was relieved. For 30 seconds, I got to be who I really am, instead of pretending to be someone else." Sarah nodded. She understood the weight of that admission better than most. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Every day. The cases, the adrenaline, the purpose, knowing that what I did mattered, feeling like I was making a difference. You made a difference yesterday. Yesterday was an accident. The rest of the time, I'm checking receipts and asking people to have a nice day." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What if it didn't have to be?" Frank looked up at her. "Sarah, don't. There's a position opening up. Private security consulting, high-end clients who need someone with your skill set and your discretion. The pay is good, the work is meaningful, and you wouldn't have to pretend to be someone you're not. I'm done with that life." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like that life isn't done with you." Frank was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. Think about it, Sarah said. You don't have to decide today, but, Frank, hiding who you are isn't the same thing as healing from who you were. Frank went back to work the next day, the day after that, and the day after that. He stood by the entrance, checked receipts, greeted customers with the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But everything was different now. The other employees looked at him differently. Customers who'd heard about the incident pointed him out to their friends. The local news had run a brief story about the heroic security guard, though Frank had declined all interview requests. Most unsettling of all was the way he felt when he looked in the mirror each morning. For 3 years, he'd been successfully convincing himself that Frank the security guard was who he really was, that Agent Morrison was just a role he'd played for 20 years, a job he'd left behind. But the 48 hours since the robbery had shattered that illusion. When the moment came, when lives were at stake, he hadn't responded as Frank the security guard. He'd responded as Agent Morrison. And Agent Morrison was still there, still sharp, still capable of making the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. A week after the incident, Detective Mitchell stopped by the store during Frank's shift. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Good. Fine. I wanted you to know the suspect you took down has been linked to 3 other robberies in the past 2 months. One of them, the store clerk, was shot. You probably saved Sandra's life." Frank nodded, but didn't respond. "I also wanted you to know," Mitchell continued, "that I ran your name through our system, just routine follow-up on civilian involvement in a felony case." Frank's attention sharpened. "Funny thing is, there's almost nothing there. Military service record, clean driving record, employment history at Walmart. But for someone who's 62 years old, there's not much of a paper trail before 3 years ago." "Is that a problem?" "No," Mitchell said, "but it's interesting. The kind of interesting that usually means someone had a job where they preferred to stay out of databases." Frank met his eyes, but didn't respond. "Like I said before," Mitchell continued, "your secret's safe, but if you ever want to talk, off the record, about what it's like to carry that kind of training around with you, I'm a good listener." After Mitchell left, Frank found himself thinking about Sarah's offer, about the weight of secrets and the cost of pretending to be someone you're not.
3 weeks after the robbery, Frank made his decision. He submitted his resignation to Maria on a Thursday morning, effective in 2 weeks. She accepted it with obvious reluctance and asked several times if there was anything they could do to convince him to stay. Frank politely declined to explain his reasons. On his last day, the store employees threw him a small retirement party in the break room. There was cake and coffee and a card signed by everyone on the day shift. Sandra, the clerk from customer service, gave him a hug and whispered "thank you" in his ear. "You saved my life," she said. "Just doing my job," Frank replied. "No," she said. "You did a lot more than that." Frank cleaned out his small locker, turned in his name tag and radio, and walked out of the Walmart for the last time. In the parking lot, he sat in his Honda Accord and called Sarah. "I am interested in that position you mentioned," he said. "I was hoping you'd call. What kind of clients are we talking about?" "The kind who need someone with your particular expertise, the kind who understand the value of discretion and experience." "When do I start?" "How about Monday?" Frank started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he could see the Walmart entrance where he'd stood guard for 3 years, checking receipts and greeting customers and pretending to be someone he wasn't. But as he drove away, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He felt like himself. 6 months later, Frank stood in the lobby of a downtown office building, wearing a tailored suit instead of a blue security vest. His hair was trimmed shorter, his posture was straighter, and his eyes held the alertness of someone who was once again doing work that mattered. The consulting firm Sarah had recommended specialized in executive protection and corporate security. Frank's official title was Senior Security Consultant, but his real job was being what he'd always been, a guardian, someone who stood between danger and the people who needed protection. His clients were CEOs who'd received death threats, federal judges hearing sensitive cases, witnesses in organized crime trials. The work was challenging, meaningful, and utilized every skill he'd developed over his 20-year FBI career. But he still thought about the Walmart sometimes, about Sandra and Jake, and the ordinary Tuesday morning when his two worlds had collided, about the weight of carrying secrets and the cost of hiding who you really are. One evening, driving home from a client meeting, Frank found himself turning into the Walmart parking lot. He sat in his car for a few minutes, watching customers come and go through the sliding doors. A new security guard stood by the entrance, younger, less experienced, but trying his best to keep people safe. Frank's phone buzzed, a text from his current client, a federal prosecutor who'd been receiving threats from the organized crime family she was investigating. Dinner meeting moved to 8 p.m. Same restaurant. Will you be there? Frank typed back, on my way. As he drove away from the Walmart, Frank thought about the different kinds of service, the different ways to make a difference. For 3 years, he'd stood guard in a blue vest, checking receipts and helping customers find what they were looking for. It had been quiet work, invisible work, but it had been service nonetheless. Now he was back to the work he'd trained for, the work he was built for, protecting people who needed protection, making decisions that mattered, using skills that few people possessed. Both jobs had value. Both involved standing guard, staying alert, being ready when danger came calling. The difference was that now he didn't have to pretend to be someone else while he did it. Frank had learned something important during his time at the Walmart. You can't outrun who you really are. You can hide it, suppress it, pretend it doesn't exist. But when the moment comes, when lives are at stake and seconds matter, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Some people are born to stand guard. Some people are built to step between danger and the innocent. Frank had spent 3 years trying to forget that about himself. He wouldn't make that mistake again.
6 months after Frank left Walmart, Detective Mitchell was working a case that brought him back to the store. As he walked through the sliding doors, he noticed the new security guard. Young, earnest, trying his best to look professional. Mitchell found himself wondering about Frank, about where he'd gone, and what he was doing. He'd never gotten the full story, but he'd learned enough to know that Frank's time at Walmart had been more than just a job. It had been a man trying to find peace with who he used to be. "Excuse me," Mitchell said to the new security guard. "Did you know the guy who worked here before you, Frank?" The young man nodded. "I heard about him. The guy who stopped the robbery. They still talk about it." "What do they say?" "That he was different. That there was more to him than anyone knew." Mitchell nodded. "There usually is." As he walked through the store, Mitchell thought about the quiet guardians who move through the world unnoticed, the people who've seen too much, done too much, carry too much, the ones who try to find peace in ordinary jobs and simple routines, hoping that the past will stay buried. But sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes, trouble finds them anyway, and when it does, the world gets a glimpse of who they really are, beneath the blue vest and the name tag and the carefully maintained anonymity. Frank had been one of them. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of protecting others in ways that couldn't be discussed or acknowledged. For 3 years, he'd tried to lay that weight down, but in the end, he'd learned what Mitchell already knew. Some people are built to stand guard, and that calling doesn't go away just because you change jobs. The quiet guardians are everywhere, hiding in plain sight, checking your groceries, teaching your children, fixing your car. Most of them will never be recognized for what they've done or who they really are, but they're there, standing watch, ready to step forward when danger comes calling, just like Frank did on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the world needed a guardian and found one wearing a blue vest and a name tag that said simply, "Security."